Yeah, good evening. It's a real pleasure to join you this evening, morning, afternoon, wherever you may be, particularly on the Friday. So thank you for giving me your time today. Um, Today, I want to give a whistle-stop tour of three core interventions for my first monograph project, an intellectual biography of the pioneering African-American activist, intellectual, and historian John Hope Franklin. Each progresses us roughly chronologically through the book and addresses kind of a key analytical issue concerning the entangled histories of ideas, race, memory, and education in modern America as they were mediated through Franklin's incredibly prominent and famed life. Um, as with any time I discuss Franklin, each of these points could be a 40-minute presentation. So I'm really excited for your questions. There'll be a lot that I cannot get the chance to talk about today that I would be very excited to talk about in the Q&A. And I'm hoping my slides move at this point. Yes, fantastic. Okay. So first, for those of you who may not be familiar, who was John Hope Franklin? Well, perhaps it's best to begin here. In the first words visitors to the National Museum of African American History and Culture in Washington, D.C. encounter when they enter the history galleries. They are Franklin's, instructing them just before they tour the replica slave ships to tell the unvarnished truth about their nation. An instruction that also found its way to the front page of the 1619 project. And that mission was really the key feature of a long and famed life in which Franklin became perhaps the major African-American historian of the late 20th century and epitomized what Peregraglo Dagbovie has called Black history's service ethic. He marched on Selma as depicted here. He contributed to the NAACP's case in Brown v. Board. And even in his 80s, he led President Clinton's One America Race initiative and spearheaded the campaign for reparations for victims of the Tulsa Race Massacre, which inextricably shaped his childhood. Across an impressive some 24 books, 29 chapters, and 91 journal articles, Franklin was then a prolific writer and expert on history who travelled the world and earned a world record for the number of honorary degrees. But don't trust me, trust his critic, Harold Cruse, who in 1979, within a piece criticising Franklin, claims that, quote, for a historian who is also black to have accomplished what John Hope Franklin has achieved in mere quantitative output in the United States between the years of World War II and 1979 ranks with that of any historian of any national group, of any historical tradition, of any period in history. Nevertheless, Franklin was most commonly recognised against his real constant protest as a black historian. Of course, we cannot ignore Franklin's blackness. He represented the mid-20th century generation of black public figures who accumulated firsts by entering at great costs historically white spaces and institutions. He was only the fourth African American to get a Harvard PhD in history, the first black chair in integrated white history departments at Brooklyn University College, of the American Historical Association, Southern Historical Association, Organization of American Historians. The list truly goes on. But iconicity, of course, can mislead. It can contort as much as it comforts. Throughout my monograph project centres on one simple question: what might be missing or what might be misleading in our prevailing understanding of Franklin as a diplomatic black liberal thinker, an icon of integration who proved in some implicit sense that America and American academia's meritocratic promises were finally coming true. Today, then, I want to tell the story of the richer, multidimensional life in history that peers behind this symbolism. I want to take snapshots from Franklin's life and puzzle them, contort them a wee bit to extract lessons about history, our craft, our passion, as it was lived, practiced, and perhaps weaponized in the United States and beyond. Now, my slightly strange title may offer some clues. A happy, angry man. You can tell a lot about someone by their funeral. John Hope's was no exception. As the mourners gathered at Duke's resplendent chapel in early 2009, they could spot many famous faces among them. Walking in, they might look rightward to see statues of Thomas Jefferson and Robert E. Lee, resonant examples of the lingering racial tensions of the New South, even in these first months of the Obama presidency. But equally, they might have paused to hear Vernon Jordan proclaim that Franklin was, quote, the master of the great American story, the story of race. John Hope wrote it, he taught it, and he lived it. Few, however, perhaps would have garnered more attention than former President Bill Clinton, who proclaimed Franklin to be a passionate rationalist, a happy, angry man. A happy, angry man, a passionate rationalist. I'll repeat those words again. As Franklin himself always sensed, within paradox lies a good historical story. The paradoxical combination, speaking theoretically, of course, tells us a little bit about the embattled societal position of black intellectuals, as theorised by figures ranging from Du Bois to Jonathan Scott Holloway, but it also speaks to the particular subtle fury of Franklin's historical scholarship. For Franklin, history was to be, quote, the sobering force in American life, the balance wheel in the American experience. His writing attempted to cut to the core of the long-standing hypocrisies of the American nation, exposing perhaps the gap between the lofty ideals and the violent realities. Through direct narratives, unadorned, accessible prose, Franklin painstakingly captured these paradoxes, while always couching his vision in the enduring possibilities of the American democratic project. So, however much then we want to speak about diplomatic persona, Franklin's scholarship always possessed a dissonance that complicates these tropes of a gentleman scholar. Diplomacy in style, in personal presentation, could often enable dissidence in intent and ideas, a framing that recovers both Franklin's prominent and celebratable achievements and also the deeper underlying tensions of his work, offering, I hope, a more complex narrative concerning black history's evolution, contestation, and defiant dissidence across the 20th century. And to go really to my first intervention, this long tradition is key to my first intervention. The first sections of my book really situate Franklin's emblematic life squarely within the far longer standing black educational strivings emphasised by all these recent scholars, among many, many others. But simply bracketing Franklin as solely an icon of integration might be perhaps to understate the intellectual sustenance, the sustainment provided, particularly in his early life, through historically black learning environments, particularly in the American South. My monograph then seeks to reveal the full vividness of these dynamic intellectual and cultural worlds. So my narrative surrounding Franklin thus starts here in Rentersville, Oklahoma, underlined there in the red line, as you can see, population about 50, with the following diary entry of his father. Quote, the year 1915 was uneventful except for the same grinding poverty caused by the continuous warfare. This year's strain was aggravated by the birth of a child, John Hope. It's hardly the words of a celebratory welcoming, but still, it was the first evidence we have of Franklin in the archive. Rentersville was one of Oklahoma's 50 all-black towns, carved out of Indian territory shortly before 1907 statehood. For black exodus settlers like the Franklins, fleeing the violence of the rising segregationist order of Jim Crow, Indian territory offered a space for a different kind of reconstruction project, one that allowed for the successful pursuit of land. These black-led settlement projects then were oriented particularly towards practical goals. In settling in indigenous territory in the mid-1850s, Franklin's family had no prospect of tribal membership. Legal rights were therefore improbable, and sovereign belonging, a sense of place, was therefore rooted more in kinship and community building than formal or civic political rights. While previously bracketed as temporary utopian escapes, I want instead to celebrate these towns' self-determinist cultures, which considered land ownership, community building, education to all be key to evidencing black civilizational capacity. These beliefs intertwined immediate black placemaking with a broader striving to carve out futures within an upcoming interracial South. So they combined ideologies of self-help, moral uplift, racial solidarity, expending great energy to demonstrate racial achievement, and in so doing disprove pseudo-biological theories of the time, asserting that black economic and political institutions, even black thinking, were inferior. Rentersville then, despite its small population, matters. First, because it situates Franklin within the exhausting yet inexhaustible strivings of African Americans to carve out humanity within the South, reshaping understandings of Southern life, history, and belonging. It also matters because this dream profoundly influenced Franklin's lifelong emphasis on the transformative powers of education. Within this very place-based niche of racial possibility, narrowly constrained by increasingly threatened state and nationwide rights, education was key to racial uplift. Rentersville didn't have running water, it didn't have electric lights, it didn't have a library, but it did have a magnificent three-story school, profiled as one of the best schools down here. Its head, Professor W.A. Hill, was identified as, quote, a true leader, identified with every move pertaining to the race's advancement. Indeed, a similar close-to-home influence came from Franklin's mother, an elementary teacher who travelled 5 miles to the east each day to teach, pistol in her hand to protect against bandits. Having no source of childcare, Franklin first learned to read at age 3, sitting at the back of his mother's classroom, following her chalk marks. It's a vital reminder, I think, of under-acknowledged black women's intellectual labour and how this monograph perhaps rejects the lone genius individualist model of intellectual generation that sometimes typifies intellectual biography, particularly, it must be added, those of historians. Instead, I wish to connect Franklin's famed life to the under-acknowledged historical labour of a far broader group of archivists, bibliographers, teachers, many of them black women who shaped and sustained his scholarship. In other words, this intellectual biography travels with Franklin while picking up the rich stories of the spaces, the institutions, and the networks that interconnected with his life. Amid the vicissitudes of a rising Jim Crow, then, education offered a means of giving permanence to the project of emancipation beyond the mere legal termination of slavery. In this context, his family epitomised then the educational reconstruction that Hilary Green has recently talked about. Hilary Green talks about how African Americans sought to transform the black schoolhouse from a temporary marginalised institution to one enshrined as a fundamental right of citizenship. The Franklin's family history then, they're moving, they're shuttling between the Deep South and Oklahoma, between educational aspiration and profound violence, therefore exemplifies recent conceptions of a long emancipation. Franklin's sense of American history, I argue, was profoundly informed by his understanding of this grappling with the aftermaths of both emancipation and Reconstruction. We should understand Franklin's early historical career then as a product of this campaign, as an attempt to advance an alternative emancipatory project rooted in the pursuit of educational sovereignty and citizenship. Taking such ideas seriously then, I'm thus building on a rich literature, particularly James Anderson's suggestion that there was nothing naive about believing and learning in self-improvement as a means to individual and collective dignity. It was not the end of Franklin's struggle for freedom and justice. It was only a means towards that end. That's clear, for example, when we turn to spaces like post-1921 race massacre, Tulsa. Franklin's father left for Tulsa to start a law practice there mere months before the events depicted here. As events in 1921 unfolded, the family grew nervous. They didn't hear from him for weeks. He survived, however, and played a key part in suits against insurance companies sent from this tent/legal office. For John Hope, then, growing up in Tulsa in the aftermath of all these events encouraged an aspirational racial pride alongside a strategic, perhaps chastened acceptance of the contained spaces in which black excellence could flourish. One key example of such spaces was Tulsa's black school system. As Franklin recalled of his high school principal, he inculcated a sense of dignity and self-respect, qualities so necessary, especially among a segregated community. Among others, John Hale has recently shown how early 20th century black schools in the South combined this politics of protest and this politics of respectability. In this sense, Woods articulated the second curriculum, a broader and unofficial pedagogy of hope grounded in idealism, race consciousness, and cultural nationalism. Woods, Franklin recalled in 1955, quote, bridged the gap between the realism of inequality and the idealism of true democracy. When the whole system of separation and discrimination encouraged self-reproach and humiliation, his contagious spirit gave us a feeling of belonging to the mainstream of American life and culture. And briefly, looking at these spaces also encourages us to think about Franklin's HBCU education at Fisk University and his start as a historian working in HBCUs in North Carolina. Jelani Favors, for example, has also talked about these as crucial waypoints for the freedom struggle in this period. Please feel free to ask me about this in the questions because there's an awful lot to say here that I can't quite get into this evening. But it's an interesting, profoundly interesting story. Finally, I think this also means stressing flourishing. It also means emphasizing limitation, analyzing those many occasions where Franklin's success in white-dominated educational spaces might have been conditioned on his reputation as a non-threatening, non-race conscious, as some white scholars use that term, black scholar. Following Abigail Boggs, my thesis often comes back to one fundamental question. What if educational systems re-entrench power relations just as much by who they exclude as who they include, incorporate, survey? Maybe it's not quite equal, but it's never an entirely neutral move. One key example would be Harvard, where Franklin became the only black student in the department, studying for his PhD in the mid-1930s. He felt, as Du Bois had written, of his own experiences in but not of Harvard. As Franklin never taught, Perhaps we might speculate due to his race, his financial security depended on several grants for the philanthropic Rosenwald Fund. As the Great Depression sent funds crashing from the Rosenwald Fund, the scheme increasingly decided to prioritize select future black leaders, cultivating what it called persons of distinctive or unusual promise. But how did one become that person? Well, a key dynamic was references, as you can see pictured here. The Rosenwald references from Fisk University are stunning documents. They slightly clarify a logic of paternalistic promotion, keenly defending Franklin's political and behavioural reliability. The notable diplomatic historian James Baxter, for example, never mentioned Franklin's race until asked about any personality handicaps. Franklin, he said, entirely unprompted by mention of race here, was, quote, one of the three most attractive African Americans I have known, with excellent manners, tact, and taste. C.C. Crittenden of the North Carolina Archives equally noted that, quote, while not docile or servile, he shows a fine perception of the niceties and not crossing the invisible line which separates the two races in the South. Even Franklin's PhD mentor, the historian Arthur Schlesinger Sr. himself, long involved with the ASNLH, declared Franklin as someone who had no character defects, quote, none except, of course, his race. These stunning quotes, then, they all marked Franklin as a HBCU student destined for leadership, yet freed from more radical tendencies. Theodore Currier, a white Fisk professor, and like many of these people I've just quoted, an ally in general to Franklin's career, noted that Franklin was significantly free from the sort of egotism that often shows itself once one is conspicuously successful in a small college. He recommended Franklin with none of the usual reservations. Briefly, such judgments continued throughout his career. Take, for instance, Franklin's paper at the Southern Historical Association in 1949 in Williamsburg. Franklin's son informed me that he was not allowed to stand above the audience at this conference, implying perhaps a power hierarchy. Indeed, while white liberal historians welcomed Franklin's intellectual provocation, numerous letters encouraged Franklin not to disturb the conference behaviourally, urging him to sleep off-site, to avoid eating in a segregated hotel, and even to use an outdoor restroom. In addition to the evidence of segregated libraries, archives, campuses, it's a stunning reminder that segregation extended to everyday facets of life. A stunning example of these logics, and perhaps their enduring perturbance, is a letter from the famed historian C. Van Woodward, recommending Franklin for a Guggenheim Fellowship shortly after this paper at the SHA. Woodward codily recalled that Franklin's paper at the SHA was in a first-rate style and was cordially accepted, in large part due to Franklin's good judgment. This anecdote about Franklin's personal demeanour, his judgment, was critical to Woodward's broader claim that, quote, for a long time American historians have been hopefully awaiting the emergence of a Negro historian for whom it was not necessary to make any apologies or allowances on account of his race. There were vigorous scholars before Franklin, yet their primary interest had usually been the promotion of a cause, the cause of their race. This prevented wholehearted acceptance, Woodward continued, among the craft of professional historians. And the word professional is doing a lot of unspoken work there. Franklin, however, represented a black historian of the type we have been hoping to see. To summarise then, this monograph captures both the vitality of historically black educational spaces and the full spectrum of behavioural, intellectual and physical segregation and white educational normativity. Following recent scholars then, you might say I'm interested in educational ecologies, environments, processes, rhythms, routines, and how these both catalysed and constrained Franklin's intellectual expression. And that means tying the high-flung ideas of Franklin's books to the day-to-day realities of intellectual and institutional life, never forgetting the violence, but also the aliveness and the beauty that survived even amid segregation. And that brings me to my second point, what I call, in a play on Peter Novick's famed book, pictured here on the left, The Ignoble Dream of Historical Objectivity. Put briefly, looking at Franklin uncovers forms of epistemic hierarchy and power relations centered on a supposed detached neutrality of whiteness. We might have heard, studying history, from all the way from Tacitus's Without Anger or Passion to Leopold von Ranke's History as it Actually Was Written, to Alexander von Humboldt's claim that history should be approached like a cloud. Neutrality, detachment, they were all key to history's operations and its rationalization. But drawing on Black study scholars, we might ponder how did these codifications of the humanities work for those who had been placed outside of constructions of the human? Well, to put that in more simple terms, I use recent studies of slavery and emotion to argue that these values were defined still in the mid 20th century in contrast to alleged black passion, politicism, emotion. Put simply, then, how could those who were visibly, inextricably marked as raced in their skin and bodies negotiate with these expectations for disembodied neutrality? How might the historical discipline, and what are the university's emotional regimes, I ask? Well, as I've argued in modern intellectual history, these dynamics are perhaps most evident concerning Franklin's most famous work, From Slavery to Freedom. I hope it might be a text that many of you have encountered. Since its 1947 publication, From Slavery to Freedom has been widely recognized as one of the most influential works of 20th century African American history, let alone American history. First written in the aftermath of World War II amid the outbreak of the Cold War, Franklin's work remains both an exemplar of mid-20th century black historiography and an ever-evolving document, having subsequently been updated into 10 editions. By 2005, it had sold over 3.5 million copies and been translated into 6 languages. Again, then, even in this begrudging recollection once more of Harold Cruse, here was presented the grand panorama of black history spread out in all its dramatic evolution. Still, Franklin was 31. He'd never taken a course in African American history. The writing process then was one of great industry and improvisation. There was no model, I was just stumbling around, later recalled Franklin. And yet it impressed Franklin's publishers, Knopf. On receiving Franklin's draft, they praised a manuscript, quote, free of all racial chauvinism, which would be an authentic and interesting work for many years to come. So we have a coded celebration here. Refined authenticity, racial chauvinism. What I argued in modern intellectual history is that this epitomized post-war publishing's expectations of Franklin's race. This was a kind of comparison that would heavily influence Franklin's public reputation for years to come. And From Slavery to Freedom's marketing, which simultaneously said that this was an authentic work while taking great care to reassure buyers that the work, while black authored, remained one of serious, detached, mature, quote-unquote, scholarship. So Knopf then energetically gathered quotes of white scholarly approval. Most explicitly, it chose for the dust jacket a striking quotation from Franklin's doctoral mentor, Arthur Schlesinger Sr., suggesting that Franklin White's, quote, without a chip on his shoulder. Reading Franklin's text would give African American readers a new pride in their race and would cause white people to reassess the role of them in American history. Such backhanded praise was a constant of Franklin's career. It earned him doctoral funding, public audiences. It might indeed have been well-intentioned given the racial regime at the time, but it simultaneously meant race was never, perhaps, inescapable. In a period Corey Garibaldi has recently described as one of interracial literary cooperation, Knopf thus found Franklin an exemplar African-American author. This was not a Jim Crow book, it promised. The loyal, trustworthy historian wrote without racial chauvinism, but with a deep attachment to the cause of freedom and equality. Most illustratively, for example, the first edition's spine showed chains partially broken, as you can see kind of in the midriff of the book there. Imagery recalling mid-20th century understandings which suggested that slavery and structured racial inequalities were bygone relics of the past. Americans now had to tackle their iniquitous afterlives, their after resonances, through individual action. Nicole Singh, for example, has memorably written of this belief that modern life inevitably yielded a steady transition from the evils of racial differentiation into holistic national sameness. And that was a promise Franklin's career was always entangled in. Another space where Franklin's racialized reception was evident was in his reviews, which show 5 key dynamics, which I want to briefly talk about here. 1, reviewers continue to express surprise that Franklin, despite being black, demonstrated objectivity. One expressed surprise that Dr. Franklin is black, for his book is so balanced, so free of racial chauvinism, that it might be the product of a white scholar. His emotional stability was extraordinary amid this period of post-war reaction. Secondly, several reviewers understood Franklin indexically. What I mean by that is they understood him as living, breathing proof of black progress in both the academy and society towards integration. This judgment nonetheless reaffirmed tropes of educating normally emotional black citizens into the sort of objective, trained, non-race conscious citizens and thinkers who could foster post-war interracial understanding. Both functions therefore policed the black historical discourse considered acceptable to black public audiences. This happened throughout Franklin's career in elevating Franklin as a desirable model. There was a risk of censoring those who instead emphasized blackness and wrote, to evoke Schlesinger's phrase again, with chips on their shoulder. So what this meant was reviewers continually contrasted Franklin to people like Du Bois and Woodson. And a parallel trajectory was that many of these readers demanded political value. They wanted a text that could disprove prejudice. The Chattanooga Daily Times, for example, praised Franklin's contribution to a field where the demagogue and ignoramus have for too long held sway. The Chicago World equally praised a forthright chronicle of the travel through the benighted thicket of human slavery to the penetrating light of freedom. And finally, and I can talk about this more in the Q&A, many black reviewers understood Franklin's book to demonstrate black historiography's increasing cosmopolitan. None other than Alain Locke himself praised a kind of desirable restraint in Franklin's work that exemplified black history's evolution from, quote, catering to minority pride and self-respect to a broader perspective and to more objective and balanced judgment. By placing African Americans at the crux of broader issues of human rights and post-war freedom, of universal suffrage, Locke argued that this book could encourage liberalized social understanding. Now, it's fair to say, of course, that many reviewers were more critical. For James Baldwin, for example, Franklin had collated a desperate massing of proof of black loyalty. Franklin's wishes to speak objectively were defeated by the very necessity to formulate these expressions on the basis of colour. So again, this is a complicated story that I can't quite summarise in this presentation. But what we see is that Franklin's race was always there, somewhere. Throughout his career, Franklin's scholarship was promoted on racial grounds that simultaneously policed the black historical expression acceptable for mass, predominantly white public audiences. Assumptions everywhere in post-war publishing, post-war academia regarding emotionality led many to bracket Franklin as both icon and advocate for racial progress. Knopf, of course, could celebrate the authenticity, the Harvard training, the loyal Americanism. Franklin, however, continually lampooned his reviewers in private correspondence and wrote his own reviews of wide-authored books that attempted to strike back against some of these logics. And indeed, we should mention that by the 1960s, other reviewers increasingly sensed these tropes, much like Baldwin. Franklin's text thus attained a second life, one of simultaneous commercial success and intellectual critique. Still, educators could teach through, around, against Franklin's text. It provided, in other terms, an intellectual terrain from which alternative and more dissenting intellectual voices could flourish. And please, again, feel free to ask me about this in the Q&A. But finally, to keep us going, from slavery freedom perfectly links to my final theme. Franklin and the position of historians, public intellectuals, and public figures more broadly in American and international life. Franklin travelled everywhere, acquiring the nickname the Professor of American Airlines and his much, much, much loved hobby, of which everyone I speak to emphasizes collecting orchids. And you might be wondering, of course, how did Franklin respond to all these judgments? Well, public historical practice, travel, represented a space where these encircling dynamics of power and race remained present, but where select opportunities still existed. Again, then, I'm profoundly interested in how the Cold War state both catalysed and contained black scholarship and Franklin's travels, both reflecting and reiterating all the kind of disciplining logics highlighted thus far in this presentation. So I argue that Franklin had to continually walk a tightrope, balancing expectations. I adopt this phrase from Glenda Gilmore's work on the black educator Charlotte Hawkins Brown. Hawkins, Gilmore writes, walked a tightrope that required her to be forever careful, tense, and calculating. One slip would end their careers. They worked without nets. What's most interesting, perhaps, is how much of this, like in 1963, centered on progress. Throughout his career, Franklin's work and public image strained against without entirely superseding a distinct liberal tendency of this era to regard America as a nation in progress in combating segregation. In other words, many of the white people Franklin was talking to emphasized civic, legal progress rather than the total resolution of economic inequalities, of social inequalities, and thus positioned race as a time-limited problem requiring time-limited solutions. In one of many unpublished essays Franklin wrote to blow off steam that he knew would never be publishable, he criticized Voice of America broadcasts for this understanding. They were immature, outmoded, and unrealistic, he argued. They reflected an uncritical, superficial reading of recent American racial progress. Focusing on American racial progress, quote, obscured the impact of Western civilization of more than 2 centuries of the domination and exploitation of the black man by the white man. It rips from the context of worldwide human enslavement the situation in the United States and fails to see the similarities and the differences between the American experience and experience in other parts of the world. Again, then, privately at least, there's diplomacy, but also defiance. But this is perhaps best illustrated closer to home at the University of Cambridge, pictured here, where Franklin became the first African-American Pitt professor in 1963. Here, Franklin arrived during a vital moment of British politics, dubbing his supposed sabbatical a snare and a delusion. Several scholars have recently illustrated how British racial politics was increasingly fervent in this period, after the founding of the West Indian Gazette and the Notting Hill Carnival. 1962's Immigration Control Act reasserted the racial characteristics of British citizenship, but equally resulted in an explosion in immigration, an identificational shift that scholars have identified from being black in Britain to black and British. The 1960s then, in other words, saw blackness increasingly mentioned and used in politics. Franklin was an attractive hire within this context. He could help to explain this, but he nonetheless came at an immense cost. While wary of becoming a freelance US ambassador in this post, he recalled by Christmas that there has not been a dull moment politically or weather-wise since we arrived. Even while lecturing bi-weekly to standing room only audiences, Franklin lectured to 12 societies and 18 universities. He opened the 1963 British Association for American Studies conference. He appeared twice on the BBC. He lectured at 4 German universities. He visited Morocco for Christmas, and he met Queen Elizabeth II at a Buckingham Palace garden party. It was, in other words, a busy year. In Britain, though, Franklin continually strove to inform the British public about contemporary race relations, particularly the March on Washington and James Meredith's campaign for admission to the University of Mississippi. England was completely engrossed by Meredith's case, Franklin wrote to him, expressing his privilege of explaining to Europeans the courageous fight that you have made, not only for us in the United States, but for justice and human dignity everywhere. Throughout his travels, then, Franklin assumed the role of a spokesperson appealing to a magnanimity, particularly in the UK, I might add, that he considered historically critical in liberalising American race relations. If Franklin then enthusiastically engaged in British life, we might say that he demonstrated a failure to recognise Britain's contributions to enslavement and its continuing role as a colonial and imperial power. And of course, this wasn't a wholly positive picture. Franklin also continued to confront racial tokenism. To the Observer, he suggested that he encountered no racial problems in England because of his cloistering within college-provided accommodation. Cambridge was, quote, like you dream the academic life was long ago. It's out of this worldly. His race, however, remained symbolically marked. Startlingly, a Time profile of Franklin observed that only an occasional reader will sense that John Franklin is himself a descendant of slaves, and subtitled a section of its report, Wrong Skin. Franklin was quoted warning that, quote, almost invariably we progress only to the extent that the white man advances in understanding that a human being is a human being. There have been African Americans as talented as I before them, but they could not get where I have because the white man was not advanced enough to let them. Perhaps the most powerful and most resonant of Franklin's mindset in these years was an essay called A People's Travail, a Personal Testament. Another one of these unpublished essays which Franklin uniquely marked as private essays. They allowed him to express again ideas that he knew he can never express or at least publish in public. Reflecting on his inability to escape racial confrontations in Brooklyn, New York, Franklin declared that he needed a sabbatical year for the burdens of being black in the land, my native land, where at least 8 generations of my family before me had lived and died. Upon travelling to Britain, however, he found that African Americans abroad were expected to explain, to analyse, discuss, criticise, rationalise American race relations. There was no escape. He was perpetually asked what race meant to him, yet he found it impossible to explain. It was, quote, extremely difficult, almost impossible to articulate even to myself what it feels like. It is so inextricably connected with the only feelings that I've ever had, so much a part of the life I've always had to live, that I know quite well that language cannot convey any more than the mind can describe the feeling that I sought to explore. It's a memorable essay. It's a striking essay, and you can see the pencil marks, the care Franklin took to write and edit this piece, despite it not being published. And I think it's particularly resonant if it's read alongside Franklin's essay of the same year, Dilemma of the American Negro Scholar, what Franklin called a favourite piece, reflecting on some problems I faced from the moment I began working in the field of history. This piece reflected on the position of black intellectuals in America, encountering a pernicious coupling of American anti-intellectualism in general and anti-blackness specifically. Franklin held that, quote, the world of the Negro scholar is indescribably lonely, and he must somehow pursue truth down that lonely path while, at the same time, making certain that his conclusions are sanctioned by universal standards developed and maintained by those who frequently do not even recognise him. I think then all of these statements reveal how the 1950s and 1960s cannot solely be bracketed as years of progress or legitimation. There were, of course, big achievements, if we look, for example, at Franklin's move to Brooklyn College, but there were also longer-standing, more insidious ideas at play. Briefly summarised then, the latter half of my book project all looks to push against what we might call a one-dimensional story of educational integration. Often integration was guarded, it was site-specific, it was loaded with expectations, and it often occurred on campus as racial inequalities remained stark mere blocks away. Often, and this was particularly the case in Chicago, universities would hire Franklin celebrating their tolerance while simultaneously driving gentrification in nearby neighbourhoods. So as Franklin insisted in the late 1970s, quote, cool, I'm not cool. I know very well that if I am to survive as a scholar, I have to survive as a man, and that also means as a black man. And in an anecdote he repeatedly repeated, even after receiving the Presidential Medal of Freedom from Bill Clinton, he was still asked for a coat by a white woman, presuming he was a valet. So what can we make of these years? Well, Franklin's year in Britain could never be a sabbatical, because as Franklin declared in From Slavery to Freedom's concluding lines, and the lines that lasted all the way into the noughties through 6 editions of this work, those knowing the realities of American history fought for those realities wherever they roamed, for they struggled both for freedom at home, for the sake of America's role, and abroad for the sake of the survival of the world. To summarise this whirlwind tour then, this monograph offers a wide-ranging, but by no means either triumphalist or decline-oriented narrative of 20th century American educational, intellectual, and racial life. My central intention is instead to evidence the stories that might be obscured by positioning integration as the central narrative of Franklin's life and the intellectual and educational worlds that surrounded him. Our contemporary politics, of course, demands narratives of greater depth and complexity, but Franklin's achievements are understood and celebrated as both first, but also contingent, contested ruptures within much the same historically sedimented order we struggle against today. I therefore situate Franklin amid a prolonged, protracted struggle that unfolded in uneven, unpredictable, non-linear ways, shaped by the entanglements of racial hierarchy, institutional decision-making, and his own intellectual defiance and dissent. More controversial and contested than previously recognised, then, Franklin's life thus requires denying one of our deepest affectations, that educational settings and institutions are apolitical arbiters of knowledge. History was an integral part of this whole, a primary means for articulating, perpetuating, and contesting racial beliefs. To study Franklin also is to recognise that anti-racist teaching isn't an insurgent project. It's not something new. It's a longer-standing tradition, one that might offer fortification in our embattled educational moment. Frank's activism and his ideas exemplify the public impact of historical scholarship and the long-standing capacity of a subtle, a dissident, and even fugitive Americanism to smuggle radical messages amid censorship and surveillance. Frank's life then produces an instructive mandate to confront educational spaces and disciplines, history included, as key sites of social struggle, resistance, and transformation. For historians, Franklin's life alerts us to history's critical role in creating, consolidating, policing ideas of Americanist. It encourages us to study not only the evolution of historical ideas, the books, but also the practical, the material mechanisms by which they are disrupted and transformed, in tandem with broader cultural, economic, political, racial, and social shifts. Put simply, Franklin's life urges us to investigate historical ideas in the open air, where they are celebrated, taught, lived, and reshaped, where they breathe, echo, and reverberate. Particularly in this 250th year, then, his scholarship cuts to the core of how the contradictions and hypocrisies that shape the United States and global mythologies continue to structure the present. As Franklin himself insisted then, to study American history with an angry rationalism, a happy anger, is to wrestle with these sharpest ironies, these most enduring violences, but also these most tantalizing possibilities. Because, as Franklin concluded in 1993, as the Rodney King trial commenced, quote, "Perhaps the very first thing we need to do as a nation and as individual members of society is to confront our past and see it for what it is. It is a past that is filled with some of the ugliest possible examples of racial brutality and degradation in human history. We need to recognize it for what it was and is, and not explain it away, excuse it, or justify it." Thank you very much.